So welcome everybody to our 14th lecture on Orthodoxy in the Russian Empire. For my students, this is a bonus lecture because this wasn't originally scheduled in our curriculum. But I felt it was necessary nonetheless to record it because it illustrates the extent to which Orthodoxy permeated even the secular lives of both ordinary and elite Russians in this period. And it permeated their lives through, principally, arts and architecture. On the street corners and in city centres of even relatively small Russian towns, one would find the church. In the cultural discourse of the time, one found discussions of religious themes. And so I think it is worth taking a brief aside to discuss the impacts of Orthodoxy and the inclusion of Orthodoxy within Russian culture in this period as a whole. And of course, I'm aware that this course covers the extremely vital period between 1800 and 1917, when Russian culture and Russian cultural products were transformed from a mere periphery of Europe and European art into a truly international center. This is the era of Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. This is a period when Russian culture truly became internationally famous. And I think to avoid giving only a few words on this subject would be unforgivable. So we're going to have this brief lecture looking at Russian Orthodoxy and its influence in philosophy, art, and architecture. Now, we could also discuss Orthodoxy and music, and certainly Orthodox themes and elite motifs from Orthodox church music plays a key role in some of the main composers of this period, people like Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov. Unfortunately, however, I really am not the most musical person in the world, and I don't feel myself particularly qualified to comment on music. So music is one area that's going to be left out of this lecture. But there is considerable literature in existence on this subject, and if you're interested, I would urge you to go and have a look. So let's begin then with philosophy, perhaps the area which most directly impacted the Russian Orthodox Church and official Russian Orthodox discourse itself. Now I'm going to start this narrative in the early 19th century, the late 1820s, early 1830s in fact. Now by this I don't want to say, and I don't mean to say, that there was no such thing as Russian thought before the beginning of the 19th century. However, I think for our purposes, starting the narrative here is most sound. These were the thinkers who truly had a profound effect on the later developments of Russian philosophical thought as it developed over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The predecessors in the 18th and especially the predecessors in the 17th centuries were largely, it has to be said, forgotten. Although there were certainly some efforts, especially by Slavophile philosophers, who we're going to talk about in a moment, to rediscover them. Now, the beginning of the 19th century history of Russian philosophical thought can largely be found in the Westernizers. In particular, in the thought of one key individual, Pyotr Chadaev, who published a series of philosophical letters first in French, but then translated into Russian a bit later, wherein he described his view on Russia and Russia's place in the world. Chadaev was rightly deemed a Westernizer. He was highly critical of Russia and of Russia's currently existing system. He largely believed that Russia played no significant role on the international cultural scene, and that the only way for it to do so was for it to be dragged into civilization by following the example set by Western Europe. Now, these letters, when they were published in Russian, were immediately controversial. Indeed, so much so that Nicholas I placed Chadaev in a mental asylum until he renounced the contents of the letters. One can understand why. Chadaev had basically declared that Russia and Russian culture and Russian civilization had contributed nothing unique to the world, and its only method, its only way forward, was to follow a Western model. He created, people following him, he created a school of thought, which is largely known today as the Westernizer school of thought. And this was mostly populated by people who followed his tenets. That Russia, in order to develop, in order to enter into a real position on the world stage, in terms of culture, in terms of society, in terms of economics, in terms of geopolitics as well, had to emulate a Western European model. And what most of these thinkers, certainly not all of these thinkers, but most, wanted for Russia by following this model was to eventually come to a sort of constitutional monarchy, where the rule of law was absolute, where the ruler was restricted in a system of balance of powers by, for instance, a parliament to some degree elected, by a constitution, and various other measures. Now, where does orthodoxy sit in this conceptualization of Russia and Russia's place in the world? Well, for Chadaev and the people following him, the fact that Russia in the early medieval period had taken the Byzantine version of Christianity had been a crucial historical misfortune. To their mind, orthodoxy was obsessed with ritual, obsessed with externalities at the expense of rational theological thought, which is held to characterize Western Protestantism and Catholicism. Russia's adoption of Byzantine orthodoxy, in other words, had led to the retardation of Russia's historical progress, and meant that orthodoxy was something that had to be overcome if Russia was to eventually join the other European nations in what was then considered civilization. That was how the Westernizers conceived of Russia's Orthodox heritage. But against them rose a countervailing tendency, the Slavophiles' Slavophism. And what did they argue? Well, it's fairly straightforward. For them, the Westernizers' utter rejection of everything native to Russia and their emulation of foreign systems of, let's say, society, culture, politics, what have you, was an unforgivable misinterpretation. For them, Russia had a special destiny, a special role, and its uniquely Russian institutions, its uniquely Russian culture, its uniquely Russian society had to be preserved and enhanced. Russia, they argued, had its own unique past and would have its own unique future in the world. And the gift that Russia would give to the world would be its own unique perspective on various historical questions. Now, the various thinkers who came up with this, they are largely internationally famous today. In the 1830s and 1840s, people like Ivan Krylevsky, Konstantin Aksakov, indeed the rest of the Aksakov family, and Alexei Khomyakov became household names in Russia and the West. And one of the key tenets of their argument was, well, yes, so Russia has its unique culture, which is going to be the basis for its unique present and its unique future. Russia should not seek to dilute that uniqueness by copying the models of other countries or other so-called civilizations. But they went back in history and they found precisely somebody who had done that, in their opinion. And that was Peter the Great. Peter the Great had decided, in their interpretation, that Russia had to be westernized if it was going to succeed, and so had imported numerous foreign models into Russia, and through absolute power had demanded that all strata of Russian society follow these models. They pointed to the nobility and the emerging intelligentsia as groups that had fallen particularly vulnerable and particularly prey to this Peter's modern westernization. The Slavophiles argued that through the incorporation of Western cultural models into things like elite education, the nobility had become almost fundamentally alienated from the rest of Russia. And when they looked at Russian society, they found one group who they believed had been largely saved from this westernization, saved from the influence of foreign models. And this was the Russian peasantry, where native Russian customs, native Russian culture, native Russian religion had largely been saved from Peter the Great's reforms. And so a key constant in Slavophile theory throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries is the idea of the Russian peasantry as an almost chosen group who would save the rest of Russia, bringing their untouched Russian heritage to the groups of the Russian people who had been alienated by the reforms of the state from their Russianness. Now, in distinction from the Slavophiles, from the Westernizers, I beg pardon. In distinction from the Westernizers, the Slavophiles urged that Russia had to draw on its own traditions. So while the Slavophiles were demanding things like parliamentary democracy, rule by law, constitutional politics, and so on and so forth, the Slavophiles argued that this could not be the case for Russia. Russia had to be governed by customs and traditions it didn't need mediating bodies like bureaucracies, like law courts, like constitutions, like parliaments. Probably the most ideal form of Russian state existence for the Slavophiles was the idea of a Russian Tsar, a Russian church, and the Russian people interacting together without the mediation of bureaucrats, laws, or at least formal laws upheld by courts, constitutions, and parliaments. And whereas the Westernizers tend to be liberals, especially in their focus on sort of the idea of individual human rights, the individual rights of citizens, the Slavophiles, as a rule, tended to be much more collectivist, tending to find the roots of these traditions not in individuals, but in groups and communities, and considering these groups and communities as the defenders of the traditions preserved in the peasantry. Orthodoxy in Slavophile thought plays a key role, and possibly its most well-developed formulation is in Alexei Homyakov's extremely famous philosophical book, The Church is One, Sokov Adna. And here, Homyakov makes orthodoxy one of the key defining features of Russian culture and Russian civilization. Homyakov engages in a dialectical argument to make, in order so that this prominence to orthodoxy, the prominence of orthodoxy makes sense. A dialectical argument, by the way, very quickly, is simply the idea that you have an argument, the thesis, the counter-argument, the counter-thesis. These two things meet in battle with each other, and what is produced is a mixture of the two, a synthesis. Very basically, that is what dialectical thought means. And dialectical thought was very popular at the time in Russia, in the 1830s and 1840s in Russia, among educated circles, because of the impact of the German philosopher Friedrich von Hegel. So what then was Homyakov's dialectic? Well, Homyakov's historical dialectic was relatively straightforward. He argued that first, in the West, there had been Catholicism. And Catholicism privileged power over freedom. It had, in Homyakov's view, an absolute pope who asserted absolute authority over the church and denied authority to everybody else. So this predominance of authority over freedom had necessarily created an authoritarian, even slavish church in the West. Now then, he argued that this authoritarianism of Catholicism had produced the antithesis, people who went to the exact opposite conclusion from Catholicism. In other words, the Protestants. And his argument was the Protestants are freedom without authority. In Protestantism, everyone was given the right to interpret the Bible as they wished, without the authority of a church to guide it. And as a result, he argued, Protestantism had largely disintegrated. There was no authority to keep all these individuals together. It had divided into various sects, and indeed, in modern Europe, he argued, it had basically emerged, it had led to nihilism. So basically, the denial of there being any kind of meaning in the world at all. Now, what then was the synthesis of Catholicism's thesis, authority without freedom, and Protestantism's counter-thesis, freedom without authority? Well, Homikov argued that was orthodoxy. Orthodoxy combined the best of these two theses and eliminated the worst. In other words, orthodoxy was the best possible mixture of authority and freedom. This mixture of authority and freedom is a philosophical quality that Homikov, in the Russian version of his letters, of his work, describes as Sobornost. Now, Sobornost is a notoriously difficult term to translate from Russian into other languages, especially into English. Homikov himself translated it into French as Catholicité, that is, Catholicity, universalism. I think perhaps we are best trying to understand it as a notion of holy togetherness, or perhaps as one of my colleagues in Estonia, Irina Peet, has put it, consularity, of holy consularity. The idea is that people were bound together in a single structure by into a hierarchical structure where authority existed. But within this hierarchical structure, people did maintain a level of freedom. The Slavophiles often argue that the holy councils were the purest manifestation of this notion of Sobornost. Unsurprisingly, the word for holy council in Russian is sabor. And so this is the idea, this is where the idea comes from. It's the idea that this is a meeting of people freely coming together, but yet their resolutions are binding on the rest of the church. So in other words, a mixture of freedom and authority. Now, I just want to be very, very clear. The Slavophiles absolutely understood that the Russian Orthodox Church, as it existed in the 19th century, did not meet the requirements of Sobornost. Many of their thinkers later in the 1870s, 1880s, precisely accused the Synod of wielding a kind of authority that was comparable to the Catholic popes over the church. That it wielded an absolute authority over the bishops, priests, and parishioners that was similar to the way in which the Roman papacy wielded its authority over its church. And this is what gave Slavophilism, which in many ways is an inherently illiberal, non-democratic, perhaps conservative tendency of thought, a reformist edge. Because as conservative in many ways and illiberal in many ways as Slavophilism was, it was still contained the weapons of a critique against synodal orthodoxy as it had developed by the 19th century. It was still capable of being used as a critique against the institutional Russian Orthodox Church as it existed in the 19th century. As such, the language of Sobornost absolutely drenches the church reform movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As we're going to discuss in our next lecture, the reform movement took many different forms, many different sort of political groupings were represented in the reform movement, but nearly all of them were strongly and heavily influenced by the Slavophile point of view. For virtually all reformers, for instance, in the late 19th century, the key task for the church should be to return to a state before the reforms of Peter the Great. This was a point of view they took directly from the Slavophiles, because so many of them came from a Russian nationalist point of view to argue that the Europeanizing, Westernizing reforms introduced by Peter had corrupted the Russian church and alienated it from its native Russian roots. So, in a practical sense, what did this mean? Well, of course, it meant the restoration of the Moscow Patriarchate. It meant the abolition of the synod, or the reduction of the synod in power, and it often meant a reduction in church bureaucracy, bringing the various layers of a church closer together without mediating forms of administrative power between them. Many use it to argue for an elected priesthood. They argued that the freedom inherent in Sobornost had to be the freedom of parishioners to choose their priests. That was a manifestation. They argued, was the key manifestation of freedom within Sobornost, was the idea of election. Some went further and argued that, well, bishops should be elected, or even the patriarch should be elected. And it seems to us today it seems a democratic ideal, but we should remember this was a fundamentally illiberal democratic ideal. This wasn't something to be, this wasn't an emulation of Western constitutional democracy. This was an idea of the theological freedom of individuals within a church structure. Now, this was, I probably would say, the last the Slavophiles in their notion of Sobornost. It was probably the last major impulse from Russian philosophy to gain widespread acceptance within the Russian Orthodox Church itself. However, this is not to say that Russian philosophy ceases to be interested in religious thought after the Slavophiles. Now, very briefly speaking, to give an unforgivably brief overview of the history of Russian philosophy in the 19th century. The 1850s, the 1870s, and into the 1880s were a period philosophically dominated by various forms of revolutionary, populist, socialist thought, which were often highly materialist in nature. They either denied the validity of religion altogether, or suggested it was not an important subject, and therefore consequently did not spend much time discussing it. In the 1880s, Karl Marx and his atheist Marxist philosophy had a tremendous impact on the Russian intelligentsia. But at the conclusion of the 1880s, the beginning of the 1890s, many started to feel that there was something wanting in Marxist philosophy. Marx, remember, argues that essentially the most important thing in the historical process is the socio-economic dimension, particularly the economic dimension. Marx never really talks about culture and about cultural questions in his work. For Marx, these are secondary questions. The major question is the economic dimension, which directly influences the cultural dimension. By the 1890s, however, many in the Russian intelligentsia were disillusioned with this overwhelmingly materialist, overwhelmingly socio-economic perspective on various problems, and particularly on various cultural problems within the Russian Empire. And so they began to look elsewhere for answers. For many, they found these answers in the recently translated works of the German radical philosopher and eccentric Friedrich Nietzsche, who precisely looked at notions of culture and consciousness rather than looking at socio-economics, like Marx said. And of course, Nietzsche, in his way, was no less radical than Marx. Nonetheless, he was radical in a very distinct way. Others turned back to Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher of Königsberg at the beginning of the 19th century, and returned to Kant's idealism. Basically, idealism is the basic notion that ideas are the movers of history. And you can see the distinction here. Marx argues socioeconomics is the major driver, the main motor of history, whereas Kant and Kant's followers argued ideas were the principal drivers of human development and thought. And Neo-Kantism becomes a considerable force in Russian philosophy. And from this neo-idealism, from this neo-Kantism, emerges a huge revitalization of interest among the Russian intelligentsia in orthodoxy and orthodox traditions. And so begins a really very fruitful period of theological and philosophical discussions within and without the Orthodox Church about orthodoxy. Now, I don't have time, unfortunately, within this lecture to go into too much depth on only one of these writers, let alone all of them. But I've given you a summary here. And the thinkers emerging, broadly speaking, from this revitalized interest in neo-Kantism, neo-idealism. Vladimir Solovyov, most famously, certainly one of the most original thinkers of original philosophical thinkers of the late 19th century, who propounded a theology of what was called Holy Sophia, that is to say, the holy wisdom, as part of his doctrine of the Trinity. Now, it should be said that this notion, this theological idea, remains extremely controversial, largely because many have accused Solovyov of essentially making the Holy Sophia a fourth part of the Trinity. Another reason he's difficult to reconcile with the Church today is because throughout his later life, he died very young. Solovyov became closer and closer with various Catholic figures. And indeed, he actually converted to Catholicism as he died on his deathbed. And that's the picture of Solovyev there, a very remarkable young man. Then there were figures like Sergei Bulgakov. Bulgakov starts his life, his intellectual life, as a populist and Marxist. He was an economics specialist in particular. Someone who focused strongly on the struggle against the imperial regime. But by the beginning of the 1890s, he'd moved away from this, precisely going on the path that I've discussed before, becoming disillusioned with the overwhelmingly materialist focus of Marx and other revolutionary thinkers, and wanting to find a more spiritual, more cultural approach to various issues plaguing the modern world. And he found this within Orthodoxy. And by the Russian Revolution, he in fact joined the Russian Orthodox Church. He became a priest. And in emigration, he fled to France in the early 1920s after the revolution. He became one of the world's most famous Orthodox theologians. Controversial because he took a very positive view on Solovyov's holy wisdom, but nonetheless extremely well-known, extremely prominent, translated into many different languages. Another figure was Pavel Florensky, a polymath who knew a great deal about a great many different fields, ranging from philosophy to economics to physics, chemistry, and biology. Although he graduated from Moscow University, Florensky already felt the pull of a more spiritual approach to matters. And so, after graduating from the university, entered into the Moscow Ecclesiastical Academy. And after that, became a priest. And was already publishing significant, indeed transformative works of Orthodox theology in the last decade of the Russian Empire, during the last 2 decades of the Russian Empire, so during the revolutionary crises and the First World War. Today, he remains a widely translated Orthodox theologian. Unfortunately, unlike his friend and colleague Bulgakov, Florensky did not escape Soviet Russia and ended up being sent to the Gulag on the former monastery island of Solovetsky, where he eventually died. And all of these figures came together to publish, with many others, to publish a collected treatise on Russian thought in 1910, a hugely influential, hugely impactful volume known as Landmarks, where they basically renounced the two directions which they thought dominated Russian politics and Russian philosophy of the era. These two directions were either revolutionary Marxism or revolutionary overthrow of the system, and conservative reactionary defense of the system. Instead, they tried to argue for a more gradualist, reformist middle way, which often took a lot from the tenets of Christian socialism. In other words, these religiously influenced figures, these people engaging with orthodoxy in a new light, tried to come up with a new program, for a different program, a third way for Russia, between the rocks of revolution and reaction. Now, one might have thought that the Synod and the rest of the Russian Church would have reacted favorably to the emergence of this Russian religious philosophy. After all, it seemed to be engaging the intelligentsia with orthodoxy again. And many Russian Orthodox churchmen had largely believed the intelligentsia and the nobility were lost causes by the 1890s, 1900s, but they had fundamentally lost their religion. However, the reality was, even though these figures were certainly now subscribing to the church and producing radical engagements with Orthodox thinking and Orthodox traditions, for many of the conservative churchmen, these individuals went too far. Most churchmen in the era were more interested, to be frank, in translating the works of the Greek fathers, produced more than 1,000 years previously, than they were applying the lessons of Orthodox theology to modern political problems. And of course, there was the fact that bishops, priests, and theologians employed in the ecclesiastical academies were necessarily involved in a very close relationship with the state. The autocratic state which these new religious thinkers had a great many problems with. There was almost an insurmountable divide, in other words, between many of the new religious thinkers on the one hand and churchmen, bishops, priests, and employed theologians on the other. Nonetheless, that's not to say there weren't attempts to reach out to this new interest in Russian Orthodoxy. As we're going to see in the next few slides, there was an attempt by the church to establish forums where these issues could be discussed. So the first one, which we're going to discuss, was the Society for the Admirers of Spiritual Enlightenment, opened in 1863 in Moscow by a monk, Yakov Krotkov, who was probably, it would have been difficult to find a more establishment churchman. He was a member of the Moscow consistory. In other words, he was both a monk and a church bureaucrat. But yet he established this new forum as a way precisely of trying to engage with Russian educated society, trying to engage with the intelligentsia and the nobility in particular, to create a forum for the free discussion of thoughts on subjects where both Orthodox churchmen and secular thinkers had a common interest. And the Society for the Admirers of Spiritual Enlightenment was actually rather successful. It set up branches in different towns outside Moscow, which were hosts of lectures, debates, and so on and so forth. They published a huge amount of material, books and pamphlets. They published 3 different kinds of newspaper, each one aimed in its language and content at different social groups. And this was a church initiative. So we can see that there was some ideas in the church in the late imperial period to engage with new types of political thought, new kinds of orthodox thought emerging. Now another one emerges at the beginning of the 20th century, the so-called Religious Philosophical Assembly, between 1901 and 1903. And this was the brainchild of the novelist Vladimir Merezhkovsky, Vladimir Merezhkovsky, and a large number of other novelists, thinkers, poets, greatly associated with the Silver Age of Russian culture. And again, they had the precise idea that this assembly would be a way for the Russian intelligentsia to present their new interest in orthodoxy, emerging from the neo-idealism of the 1890s to Russian Orthodox churchmen. And maybe through discussions, open, wide-ranging discussions, they would be able to reach a common ground between them. Indeed, it hosted a variety of what we could call celebrity churchmen. Various archbishops and bishops took part, along with notorious names from the world of secular culture. Merezhkovsky himself, a notorious eccentric, Nadezhda Gippius, another entirely unconventional thinker and writer. The problem was that when these two groups met face to face, they ultimately had very little to say to each other, or rather say, they had very little in common with each other. It should be noted, in one of the meetings, they discussed the question of freedom of conscience. And unsurprisingly, the novelists, writers, and so on and so forth, Merezhkovsky himself in particular, supported the notion of freedom of conscience, because from their perspective, religion was inherently a question of mankind's freedom. However, at least several of the Orthodox churchmen stood up and rejected the notion of freedom of conscience outright. One called freedom of conscience a principle with demonic origins. Another said that freedom of conscience was the equivalent to the unregulated sale of opium in the streets. So you can see here the gulf between the two groups. The churchmen are largely attacking freedom of conscience because they stand for the institutionalized interests of the church and to an extent the state. Whereas the intelligentsia come from a perspective of defending, or a certain degree from a perspective of liberal freedoms, the freedoms and rights of the individual being a core part of their philosophical worldview. In the end, the 2 years of discussion were largely fruitless. The notes, the minutes were published in the journal run by Andrei Bieli, himself a famous poet and novelist. But Konstantin Pobedonosov, the procurator, eventually closed the meetings down, saying that they essentially held that they were doing no good, were bearing no fruits for anybody. So that then was, in brief, the history of the engagement of Russian thinkers with orthodoxy in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the attempts failed as though they were, largely speaking, of the Russian Orthodox Church to try and engage with those thinkers. Now, however, we should consider in this period that a lot of Russian philosophical thinking was not taking place in the sort of format that we usually imagine in dry philosophical treatises, but rather it was taking place on the pages of Russian novels and in the verses of Russian poems. Russian literature has gained a justified reputation for being extremely philosophical. And in many ways, in the 19th century, in conditions of often very difficult censorship, Russian literature functioned as a gateway for philosophy. Now I just want to discuss the role of orthodoxy in a few works of some key Russian novelists and Russian poets, many of whom I'm sure you've heard of. Just to give you, however, a brief outline of the sort of structure of Russian literature, or the history of Russian literature in this period. So firstly, there is a discussion usually of the golden age of Russian literature. And this begins roughly in the late 1820s and lasts until the 1870s. It's sparked by the poetry of Alexander Pushkin and encompasses internationally famous figures such as Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Turgenev. In poetry, Lermontov. On the stage, Ostrovsky. A few others who are still still not so much known in the West, but are becoming better known thanks to new translations. People like Leskov, the satirist Saltykhin Shidrov, and numerous others. Typically, what unites the writers of the Silver Age is an interest in social realism, social and psychological realism. And these, the most sort of accepted artistic format of the period was the huge novel. I'm sure everyone's aware of the legendarily massive status of Tolstoy's War and Peace, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and so on and so forth. And should be, I mean, this is to some extent a generalization. Of course, there were famous poets writing in short form as well. And Dostoevsky and Tolstoy were also themselves short story writers of some repute. But nonetheless, the sort of canonical format of Russian literature in the Golden Age became the grandiose, huge novel. Now, the Silver Age of Russian literature is largely regarded as beginning in the 1890s and going on to the Russian Revolution and a bit beyond. And it figures key individuals such as the aforementioned Andrei Bely, Alexander Blok, Vasily Rozanov, Vladimir Merezhkovsky, and to an extent Maxim Gorky as well. And typically speaking, these writers were acted in almost a rejection of social realism. They are much more easily equatable with the sort of modernism going on in European literature at the time. Think James Joyce and Ulysses, for instance. Their idea was to play with sounds and representations rather than try and reach a photographic, realistic representation of society in their works. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given this obsession with sounds, this obsession with form, the key formats for most of the key writers of the Silver Age were poets. Blok, Bely, Merezhkovsky were largely poets. Now, when it comes to looking for orthodoxy in these works, we should note a few key points. For a start, none of these writers came from the clerical estate. They didn't really have an intimate engagement with the Russian Orthodox Church as a whole. Most of them came indeed from nobility and intelligentsia families, which had long legacies going back into the 18th century of maintaining a certain distance and a certain, perhaps even a certain contempt for the church. As a surprise, Unsurprisingly, we find that often in these works, the depiction of the Russian Orthodox Church is not particularly positive. Now, there are some exceptions. Nikolai Gogol, who I mentioned just previously, he's still relatively unknown in the West today, but he's becoming better known thanks to some new translations. Wrote a novel called Cathedral Folk, which is precisely a story about 3 priests running a cathedral in a small provincial town in the middle of the Russian countryside. And generally speaking, Leskov's approach is quite positive. He certainly doesn't go out of his way to condemn the priests or their lives in the church. That being said, he does also indulge in some of the traditional anti-clerical tropes of the period, depictions of drunkenness and gluttonous as mainstays of clerical life, for instance, feature within this work, largely because Leskov is hoping to get a laugh out of his audience. He wants to use these tropes as a joke at the clergy's expense. Perhaps even more sympathetically, we have someone like Anton Chekhov, the famous playwright and short storyist, who several of his short stories, some of his most famous short stories, are focused on the lives of churchmen. I've given you here the example of the bishop, which really exemplifies sort of what Chekhov's approach to his short stories, where he draws the human being first, and then looks at their rank, their position in society second. So for Chekhov, it's often a case of trying to have a sympathetic depiction of these individuals, regardless of their rank or position in society. Although there is relatively few descriptions or discussions of life within the Russian Orthodox Church itself in these novels, we often, in the novels, poetry, short stories, plays of the Silver Age, the rituals, calendar of the Orthodox Church often play key roles in the background as scene setters. Perhaps one of the most famous instances is the sort of Orthodox wedding ceremony held between 2 of the principal heroes of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Levin and Kitty, where the Orthodox marriage rituals play a very key role in the chapters describing these events. Now, one figure who really did take his engagement with Russian Orthodoxy very, very seriously was the Ukrainian writer Nikolai Gogol. So just in case very few of you know, Nikolai Gogol rose to prominence in Russian society, firstly as someone who wrote folk stories, often in Ukrainian for an elite audience in Russia, where there was a fashion, a vogue for examples of Ukrainian folklore and Ukrainian history and Ukrainian language. Later, however, he began to transition into Russian language short stories, and finally really tried to make an attempt to write a Russian novel. Very famously, his book, Dead Souls. Now, the problem with Dead Souls is when you pick it up today, is actually this is only the first part of what was intended to be a much, much bigger story. Dead Souls tells the story of a trickster going around the Russian countryside, trying to swindle various stereotypes of the Russian rural order. And the novel it's an extremely comedic process where this very clever, very amoral trickster basically deceives these highly immoral landowners, highly immoral, hypocritical landowners of their belongings. Now, initially what Gogol had wanted was for there to be another 2 or 3 parts of this novel, where the trickster, the con man, is caught and undergoes a religious conversion, realizes the wrongs of his way, and becomes a religious figure. However, Gogol was never satisfied with how he described this, and he actually burnt those parts of his novel and then died a few days later. And this is perhaps representative of the way Gogol himself, in the last decade of his life, was becoming an ever more religious figure. He spent a great deal of time studying the works of the church elders, and in particular, the contemporary works produced by the monks of the Optina monastery. Now, many people made the mistake that because Gogol satirized the existing imperial order, that he was a critic and opponent of that order. Well, he proved them all wrong when in 1847 he released his book, Select Places from Correspondence with Friends, in which Gogol not only defended the absolute rule of the Tsar and the nobility, but even defended serfdom, which alienated, this defense of serfdom alienated most of the radical and liberal intelligentsia from Gogol. And it is noticeable that in this work, Gogol precisely adapts the well-publicized sermon style of the famous Metropolitan of Moscow, Metropolitan Fedor Dostoevskii. And it is not surprising that within this same work he defended very strongly the privileges and the institutional position of the Russian Orthodox Church. I think we'll skip Herzen today. I think we haven't enough time. So I'm going to move on to Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, Dostoevsky, of course, justly so, is one of the great writers of world literature. He, in his very limited autobiographical writings, often remembers this almost sacred memory of being a child, visiting with his mother the Orthodox parish church, and the atmosphere created by singing incense, and so on and so forth. Now, when his first novel, Poor Folk, released at the beginning of the 1840s, Dostoevsky was propelled from essentially being being an army engineer, that's what he was, into a literary superstar overnight. And he started to become heavily involved in the intellectual salons of St. Petersburg, where he was introduced into radical politics. Now, it seems likely that during this period, he became an atheist. We're not entirely sure whether he did or did not, but the way he writes about it later seems to imply that he did reject not only orthodoxy, but Christianity and belief in a God entirely. And he became involved in revolutionary circles. And following the the European revolutions of 1847, 1848, Nicholas I's regime became very strict towards any manifestation of revolutionary thinking. And so the circle to which Dostoevsky belonged was entirely arrested. They were subjected to a fake execution. In other words, they were marched into one of the central squares in St. Petersburg, led to believe that they were going to be shot, at the very last moment, had the Tsar's reprieve read out to them. Dostoevsky's reprieve was that he would be sentenced to several years in a Siberian labor camp, and a few years after that to serve in the army. And during the horrendous experience of firstly imprisonment for several months in the Peter Paul fortress in St. Petersburg, then of being marched miles and miles and miles into Western Siberia, and then his experience of the labor camp, Dostoevsky experienced a spiritual transformation. He renounced his atheism and became a fervent Christian believer. Most famously, this was summarized in a line in a letter he wrote to one of his female friends back at home, where he said, "If someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth and that in reality the truth were outside of Christ, then I should prefer to remain with Christ." In other words, even if someone could prove to him that Christianity was false and the truth lay elsewhere, he would still prefer to be a Christian. And in many ways, his sentence has been used by various art critics to analyze and interpret his subsequent works. And indeed, precisely this experience, Dostoevsky's experience of going from cynical, educated atheism to a rebirth through suffering into Christianity, is a core part of the plot of many of his most famous works. We think only Crime and Punishment, for instance, where Raskolnikov, the anti-hero, influenced by an atheistic utilitarian philosophy, murders two women. Through his suffering, both as his conscience catches up with him, but also when he gives himself in and goes to a labor camp, he is eventually reborn as a fervent Christian. Now, there are various ways in which the Orthodox Church itself and some Orthodox traditions filter into some of Dostoevsky's fiction. Dostoevsky visited the Optina elders, for instance, was highly influenced by the Optina elders. And we can see this very famously in his work, Brothers Karamazov. In the Brothers Karamazov, you have the figure of the elder Zosima. And Zosima is very much meant to be an embodiment of the tradition of the Optina elders. A wise man, humble, a sinner in a previous life who has renounced his past, someone who's open to everybody, who greets everybody with warmth, who is not quick to condemn sin, and is always willing to offer forgiveness to anybody who asks for it. And against this, I think Dostoevsky counterposes a more traditional version of Orthodox monasticism in the foil to Zosima, the monk Ferapont. And Ferapont is very much a much more sort of traditionally conceived Orthodox monk, a ascetic who hides in the woods, doesn't wash, wears only rough clothes, swears at people, is hostile. So Dostoevsky tries to put, I think, these very two traditions of Orthodox monasticism against each other. In the same novel, Dostoevsky also plays with traditional folk conceptions of sainthood. When Zosima dies, his believers all hope that his body will not decompose, because this will be proof of Zosima's sainthood. However, the body does decompose, much to the shock of one of the novel's key characters, Alexei Karamazov, who is one of Zosima's followers. However, it emerges that this is simply a test for Alexei. Alexei cannot define Zosima's holiness, sainthood, and goodness on whether or not the body decomposes. So here we see Dostoevsky in the novel playing very much with folk Orthodox beliefs in order to propel the narrative and propel his characters forwards. And there are various other scenes in this novel as well which reflect some of the Orthodox folk beliefs and practices we've seen within this course. One of the first times we meet the elder Zosima, for instance, is when he is expelling a demon from a possessed woman. Now, especially in the 1870s, as Dostoevsky reached towards the end of his life, he became increasingly involved in political thought. Most notoriously, this is when he took up the role of editor of the journal Citizen, Grazdanin, and published there on a very regular basis his diary notes. So these were not diary notes meant in a private sense, they were rather diary notes addressed to a public. And today you can generally find these published in one or two volumes as the notes of the diary of a writer. And here we see the way in which Dostoevsky's orthodoxy and view on orthodoxy and his imbibing of Slavophile philosophy, how these developed his political views. Dostoevsky, taking from the Slavophiles the condemnation of both Catholicism and Protestantism, decided to dub Europe as a graveyard. Europe was dead, in Dostoevsky's perspective. Its two religious / philosophical / political tendencies, Catholicism and Protestantism, had led to their necessary extremes. He called them socialism and nihilism, and it was on the brink of cultural death. Only orthodoxy and its synthesis between these two branches of thought, Dostoevsky argued, could revitalize and even restore Europe as a civilization. Now, how was orthodoxy to do this, given the general lack of Orthodox churches, of orthodoxy in Western and Central Europe? Well, at least to begin with, Dostoevsky doesn't really propose anything for this. But in the heightened political tensions of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, he directly says that in fact Russia's job, Russia's historical mission to the West is to conquer it so it can bring the spirit of orthodoxy to these locations and thereby cure them of their spiritual and political bankruptcy. Now, although I think Dostoevsky was grimly interested in the Old Believers, he certainly didn't have much like for them, as we can see in various parts of his novels. So, for instance, notoriously, Raskolnikov's name comes from the Russian word Raskolnik, in other words, a schismatic, in other words, an Old Believer. And there are occasional scenes of Old Believer life in Dostoevsky's novels, which certainly do not reflect well on the Old Believers. Probably most famous is in The Idiot. Rogozhin, a very rich, wealthy son of a merchant, comes from an Old Believer family. And when we visit his home in St. Petersburg, there are several entirely creepy and disturbing scenes set in the priestless chapel in Rogozhin's house. And Rogozhin himself, throughout the novel, is set as an almost demonic, villainous presence. So certainly, Dostoevsky didn't have much in the way of support or nice things to say for the Old Believers. Although it has to be said, I think, by the end of the 19th century, he was in a distinct minority of major Russian writers who were increasingly depicting the old believers in a positive way, especially through a Slavophile lens. People who argue that the old believers had broken away from the Orthodox Church before its corruption by Peter the Great, and therefore the old believers maintain a sort of maintain the Russian tradition in a purer way than Russian Orthodoxy itself. So that then is a very, very brief guide to the role of Orthodoxy and Orthodox thinking and Orthodox ceremonies in the writings of some of the key authors that emerged from Russia in the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, church architecture, of course, plays a fundamental role in not only in creating the environment for believers themselves, but also in creating the topography, the religious landscapes of urban locations. And so it's worth, I think, just a very brief discussion about the evolution of church architecture from its beginnings, the baptism of Russia, down until the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. So when Russia took orthodoxy from when the princely state of Rus took orthodoxy from Byzantium, it took the Byzantine church architecture as well. Although peculiarities representing some transitions to local conditions also existed. Now, the oldest Orthodox church in, let's say, the land of the Eastern Slavs that still exists today is the Cathedral of Sofia in Kiev, which was built around 1017 to 1037. One sees precisely the Byzantine form of this church. The borrowing of Greek architectural forms from the Byzantine Empire. But nonetheless, there were some changes. So, for instance, it was generally much larger than most Byzantine churches of the period. And as a consequence, it had a lot more domes and naves inside. So it had 13 domes and 5 naves, whereas the traditional Byzantine model had 1 dome and 3 naves. And this was done, I think, firstly, this was the symbolic beginnings for Christianity among the Eastern Slavonic peoples. And as such, it was built to be extremely spectacular. And it was also built to try and visibly demonstrate some of the key lessons, the key facts to this newly Christianized people from Christian history and from the Bible. So why did it have 13 domes, for instance? Well, the idea was precisely to symbolize, and therefore to teach to people on the outside, to people looking at the building, the notion of the 12 apostles and the one figure of Christ. Now, the church in Kiev, the cathedral in Kiev, the Sofia Cathedral in Kiev, was followed by a great outburst of very creative, very large-scale church construction, not just in the area around Kiev, but in places like Novgorod, Pskov, and in many other ancient Russian towns, which began to develop their own traditions and their own experiments with architectural forms. However, a real key change to the Mongol invasion of Russia in the 13th century. The Mongol invasion essentially destroyed much of the wealth of the princes of Russia. These were the people who were funding church construction at the time. Destroyed much of the wealth of the church, and also meant that raids from the south and east became much more regular. As a consequence, churches and cathedrals built in this period sacrifice experiments and sacrifice size for being small, conservative, and compact. Compact in order to make them easier to defend from any wandering Mongol war party after a bit of easy loot. In some areas, though, outside of direct Mongol domination, that is to say the medieval city republics of Novgorod and Pskov, some of the architectural experimentation that had been characteristic of early church architecture continued and developed into their own distinctive styles. Equally, we see in areas of the Western Ukraine the borrowing of Gothic and other Western styles into their church construction. This is a model of what the Sofia Cathedral would have looked like when it was first constructed. As I said, it still exists today, but it's been remodeled and refurbished and rebuilt, so it no longer really looks truly like the form it had 1,000 years ago. So this is I had to give you a model here. Now, if you allow me this sort of, as I said, it's a very brief overview and survey of architecture, church architecture in Russia. So I'm going to skip forward to a very different time in the Russian state, history of the Russian state, which was the 16th century, when by this point Moscow had become predominant and the princes of Moscow were militarily successful, quite wealthy, and the major power figures in the region. And they increasingly began to demonstrate this with ever more ambitious and elaborate forms of church construction. One of the most symbolic is the Cathedral of St. Vasilii the Blessed. I'm sure you all know this is the cathedral that stands on Red Square today. And it was built to celebrate Ivan's victory over the Kazan and Astrakhan Muslim khanates. Now, this cathedral is still a bit of a mystery for the historians of church architecture. No one's really quite sure where it comes from, because there don't seem to be any churches like it beforehand, or indeed immediately after. The leading hypothesis that I've seen, at any rate, is that this was an attempt to combine the distinctive style of northern Russian wooden churches with incoming forms of Italian Baroque coming from northern Italy. Sorry, not Baroque, I beg your pardon, Renaissance. The Renaissance style coming in from Italy. Indeed, the Kremlin building that stands alongside St. Vasili's was very much the product of Renaissance Italian stoneworkers combining native traditions with their own styles. And it should be mentioned, I'll just mention this as an aside briefly, this kind of interesting dinner party fact, is that the sort of very distinctive colouring of the domes that we're used to today were added actually quite a lot later in the 17th century. So there you are, just in case you needed to be reminded, there is a picture. The 17th century also saw innovations in Russian Orthodox church architecture. From the end of the 17th century, Western influence was becoming more and more pronounced in Russia. After all, this was the period of Alexei Mikhailovich and the early reign of Peter the Great, both of whom were actually involved in bringing in elements of elements of Western European science, Western European personnel, Western European administrative forms, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that comes in with this is an interest in the counter-Reformation Catholic Baroque, which resulted again in a fusion of Russian Orthodox architectural forms like the typical onion domes and so on and so forth, with the latest trends from Western and Southern Europe. And it's fairly easy to sort of identify these churches, those few of them that still exist today in Russia. Regrettably, a great many of them were destroyed under Stalin. But those few of them you can still find today are generally characterized by things like a huge mass of domes and spires, elaborate ornamentation, and often a heavy reliance on brick as a construction material. Now, another transition that can be noted in the Russian church architecture, of course, comes under Peter the Great. And some of the leading scholars of Peter the Great have largely commented on his very Protestant views of religion and the fact that he borrowed a great many administrative religious forms from Protestant churches of the time. The Synod, for instance, is largely believed to be a borrowing from particularly the Swedish Lutheran Church. And unsurprisingly, therefore, we see, I think, at least in some of the churches built under Peter the Great's reign and directly afterwards, the intrusion of some Lutheran Northern European forms into church architecture. The most prominent of these is the St. Peter Paul Church, which stands in the center of the fortress of St. Peter and Paul today in St. Petersburg. And this was really the sort of center of imperial power, a fact which is manifested through the burial of Russia's Tsars in the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral. Today you can find all of the bodies from Peter the Great to Nicholas II in the St. Peter Paul Cathedral. Anyway, in other words, this was really one of the central churches of the imperial family and of imperial power. Now, while it does take a lot from Muscovite Baroque, bringing in a counter-Reformation architect, Tranzini, it is still remarkably reminiscent of some of the Northern European churches of the period, and is as such distinct from many of the churches that followed it. It has, for instance, a very long nave and two much shorter ones, therefore borrowing a great deal from a European tradition which had previously been absent in Russia. And through this church, Peter essentially built into stone his commitment to Westernization. So here you can see it. As you can see, again, the idea of, I haven't bought my laser pointer, which is very foolish of me, but a very long nave with two very shorter naves sticking out of the sides. Very typical from Western Europe, but very untypical for Russia before or since. Now again, we leap forward a century and we come to St. Petersburg again, and another monumental cathedral built by explicitly at the instructions of the Russian Tsars. And this is the Kazansky Cathedral, built between 1799 and 1811. Paul I, who was in charge of who ordered the construction of a church, wanted it to very much resemble St. Peter's in Rome. In other words, the headquarters of the Vatican. And as we're going to see in a minute, I hope you'll be able to see the sort of resemblance. The outside colonnade, for instance, looks very much like that which you find in the square in St. Peter in Rome today. Now, after Paul's death and his son Alexander's victory over Napoleon, this church was very much used to symbolize Russian victory over the French invading forces. So, for instance, the Field Marshal Kutuzov, who was the leader of the Russian forces in this period, his grave is inside the church, and on top of his grave you can find, in fact, some of the examples of the French eagles, that is to say, the French military standards that the Russian armies took as they drove France out of Russia and back across Europe. So here you can see this very distinctive colonnade, again designed precisely to make the church look like St. Peter's in Rome. And no doubt this is a statement almost of Russia's, the view the Tsars had on Russia's place in the world. Maybe it was that it was itself a competitor to Rome, both in the modern religious sense and to the imperial legacy of Rome. Now, Nicholas I sought a different approach than that which had dominated Russian church architecture since really the end of the 16th, end of the 17th centuries. He wanted to return to a more distinctively Russian, unique style. He wanted a church architecture that could distinguish between Russia and the West. And to do this, he turned to the Byzantine tradition, particularly employing throughout his reign the church architect Constantine Thon, who was essentially, for all intents and purposes, the official church architect of Nicholas. And he took traditional Byzantine motifs and combined them with, firstly, various parts of 19th century European classicism, but also with some elements of traditional Russian church elements. In other words, Nicholas's attempt to return to some sort of, to essentially make an authentic Russian church architecture basically ended up creating an entirely unique and never seen before combination of variety of elements, borrowing from both Byzantine, Western, and previous Russian traditions. Now I'm just going to show you the picture of the cathedral in Moscow in a moment, which is built precisely in this style, very famous in this style. It took them an extremely long time to construct. But it's worth noting that Nicholas I, for the first time, essentially created what was an official church style for the rest of the Russian Empire. He basically turned Constantine Thon's program of church construction into law, which means that basically all churches constructed between about 1841 and the early 1880s follow almost to the letter this particular form of church construction. So here is the church in Moscow. And it was finished in the early 1880s, and then destroyed rather spectacularly by the Bolsheviks in the 1920s, who tried to, well, originally what was going to happen was this was going to be the place for an enormous palace of the Soviets, and the statue of Lenin on top alone was intended to be bigger than the Statue of Liberty. But the problem is this site is very close to the river. The soil is not built to support a building of that size. And so the project to create this massive palace of the Soviets was abandoned. In the Soviet period, this was actually the location of the swimming pool, notorious as a bit of a den of crime. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the mayor of Moscow ordered the reconstruction, the precise reconstruction of Nicholas I's cathedral. Now, a major change, a major shift comes with the reign, in church architecture, comes the reign of Alexander III. Alexander III's father, Alexander II, was assassinated in St. Petersburg in 1881 by populist revolutionaries. And for his son, Alexander III, and many who supported Alexander III, this was the unfortunate consequence of his father opening up to the West. Alexander III took a very much more nationalist approach, an approach based very heavily on Slavophile thought, in order to just try and attempt to distinguish Russia, not only distinguish Russia from the West, but also to create a very dominant symbol of Russian imperial power. He wanted to abandon architectural reforms that had been introduced since Peter the Great and return to the 16th and early 17th centuries. Now, the most spectacular instance you can see of this today is undoubtedly in St. Petersburg, because Alexander III decided he would build a cathedral on the very site that his father was assassinated. And as a massive symbol of his rejection of the European style in which St. Petersburg was built in, and all that represented, he built this very neo-Russian style cathedral in the very center of St. Petersburg. And it's still, I think, when you see it today, it jars. It's very clearly not right. You have these neoclassical, neo-Baroque St. Petersburg buildings surrounding it, and then you have this massive eyesore monument to late 19th century Russian nationalism in the middle. Clearly, things don't gel. But again, just as his grandfather, Nicholas I, when Nicholas I had sought an authentic Russian style, the style Alexander III ultimately creates doesn't really have that many connections with the Russian past. What it really is a fusion of things that people had sort of come to associate with the Russian past. It wasn't so much of a return to a tradition, but a reinvention of a tradition. And it should be noted that these kind of new churches, monasteries, convents, cathedrals built in the Russian national style are used explicitly in the border provinces of the Russian Empire to assert, in a very clear, visual way, Russian dominance over these regions. I believe I've spoken in the previous lecture about the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Tallinn, which is precisely meant to assert Russian dominance over the Baltic provinces. And these kind of churches appear not just in cities, but throughout the countryside, not just in the Baltic, but in Poland, in the Caucasus, and in various other borderlands. So here you have the Cathedral of the Spilt Blood in St. Petersburg. Again, the cathedral Alexander III built on the site of his father's assassination, meant as an explicit rejection in some ways of his father's legacy and the legacy of St. Petersburg itself. And here you have the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in in Tallinn, which is, as I just stated, was meant to be a statement of Russian imperial power in a non-Russian, non-Orthodox borderland. So that brings us to the end of our brief trip through Russian church architecture. And now I'd just like to very quickly talk to you about painting and the visual arts, very quickly. So the first part of painting that we should note are one of the most distinctive features of Orthodoxy and indeed of Russian Orthodoxy, that of the icon. Now, icons have long been used in Orthodox worship across the Orthodox world, And they're found in an incredible number of contexts, and they can be made of an incredible number of different materials. One can typically find, for instance, especially today, cardboard icons kept in the front of buses and cars, for instance, in varieties in different Orthodox countries. Or one can find some of the most elaborate icons in cathedrals and churches and private homes and collections, often made of the finest wood, painted with inordinate care, and their frames covered in the rarest and most expensive jewels, gold, silver, and bronze. Their depictions, similarly, are extremely varied, covering everything from Jesus, the Virgin Mary, different saints, but also sometimes historical scenes and scenes taken from the Bible. Now, one of the most common misunderstandings from Western traditions, especially from the Protestant tradition, of icons is that the Orthodox are breaking various commandments when they worship at icons. They're essentially breaking the commandments which forbid the worship of graven images. However, this is not the argument of Orthodox theology or the Orthodox Church. They believe that when people worship at icons, they are worshipping the divine grace, which is transmitted through the icon. So in other words, they are worshipping God himself as transmitted by the image of a particular holy figure, holy place, or indeed the visage of God himself. Now, just to talk about the artistic style of icons. A criticism we often hear, particularly from European observers in the 17th and 18th centuries, is that icons are not realistic. And they are not meant to be realistic. They are meant to be precisely an icon of a figure, a symbol of a figure. This is the eternal image of how a figure sits in the kingdom, of how the portrayed individual sits in the kingdom of heaven. It is not meant to be a realistic depiction of a human being. And similarly, geographical scenes with most icons do not seek to provide a realistic notion of three-dimensional space. Again, this is the idea of trying to convey a world that is in the icon, a world that is fundamentally different from our own. The timeless, eternal, sacred kingdom of heaven. It's for this reason many icons forego backgrounds entirely and just have blank gold. This is meant to draw the thinker into a timeless world, the timeless world of the divine. Some misunderstandings also come from the way in which icons have been produced. Increasingly from the Renaissance onwards in the West, we have associated art and artistic innovation with individual creators. This was, by the way, a very artificially developed cult in the Renaissance. Precisely the idea of developing a cult of a particular artist. And we increasingly think of the idea, and we also from this time begin to think of the idea of innovation as something that is inherent to art. That artists should be trying to do at least something different from what has gone before, or perhaps improving on what has gone before. However, these two ideas, the idea of individual authorship and innovation, cannot be said to apply to orthodox understandings of iconographic art. Firstly, traditionally, and to a large extent still today, the icon is not the product of an individual genius artist or figure. It is the product of icon workshops, where people work together, monks and nuns generally, but also others in the church, work together to produce these holy images. And secondly, and partially as a consequence, there is no great importance attached, generally speaking, to the individual icon painters. Generally speaking, and we're going to see a few exceptions to this in a second, but generally speaking, there is no importance given to an individual icon painter. Another point to keep in mind, which is different, is that icons are not supposed to innovate. Rather, artistic perfection in icon painting comes from copying, as closely as possible, a previous model. Often because the previous model is held to have its roots in some sacred image that was either painted by a great religious figure in the past. For instance, it was argued that Saint Luke painted the original icons of the Virgin, and so thereby, by copying previous models, one was copying Saint Luke. Or it was held that many icons had been divinely created and were divinely created, and were accidentally found by individuals. So the idea was to copy this divine model. So this is one way in which these are several ways in which Russian iconographic art is distinct from Western traditions. It doesn't place a tremendous amount of importance on the individual artist, largely because the icons are products of workshops, and it does not put a tremendous degree of emphasis on innovation or originality. Rather, the emphasis is on the perfection of the copying, in most cases. Now, I'm going to bring up an example in a second of some different ones. Yes. So, but there has been, in subsequent centuries, particularly under the influence of Western views of art, attempts to look at some particular individual iconographers as being particularly important. And without a doubt, the most famous of these individual iconographers is Andrei Rublev, a medieval Russian iconographer working at the end of the 14th and the beginning of the 15th centuries. And his icons remain considered one of the heights of Russian or Orthodox iconographic art. For those of you who haven't seen it, by the way, I tremendously recommend Andrei Tarkovsky's biographical movie, Andrei Rublev, very much worth seeing. For, I think, what is actually quite a both an artistic and an honest depiction of late medieval Russia. So here we go through. This is Rublev's most famous icon of the Trinity. However, icons and iconography had not been immune to change. Regardless however much tradition has stipulated that the idea is to copy perfectly, this idea has been influenced by outside sources. And we see this most particularly in Russian iconography after the reforms of Peter the Great in the late 17th, early 18th century, when European art increasingly played a role in Russian secular paintings. And here you can see influences, again, from the Counter-Reformation Catholic Baroque. But you also see basically attempts to create realistic 3D figures with a realistic three-dimensional notion of space. Now it should be said, well, often you find old believers will reject these 18th century Baroque styled icons. For many Orthodox today, they can use both more medieval depictions and these kind of newer icons in their worship. You can find different churches with many different styles of icons. Now, as for religion in secular painting in Russia in the 17th and before the reforms of Peter the Great, but there really wasn't much in the way of secular painting before the reforms of Peter the Great. Most art was dedicated to either icons or creating frescoes on the walls of churches, which heavily emulated iconographic styles. Probably the most accessible form of art were the icons, these frescoes, and also one found some sort of secular paintings occasionally decorating church manuscripts. This changed again fundamentally with the reforms of Peter the Great, because now, firstly, Western European artists are brought into Russia, but increasingly also Russian artists are dispatched abroad. And with them, they come back and they bring back with them the latest in the Western European styles in painting. In 1757, the creation of the Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg really was the embodiment of this idea of basically the importation of European styles of art and its use in creating a Russian secular school of art, of painting. They borrowed precisely the sort of models and subjects which were valued at the time in the West. So history painting, for instance, were paintings of historical scenes from Roman and Greek history, were particularly privileged throughout the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries. There are relatively few painters who went out there to depict Russian life, quote unquote, as it was. The very few people who did approach sort of Russian subjects often placed it in the frame, for instance, of the Italian rustic style. So one finds paintings of Russian peasants looking very, very similar to paintings of Italian peasants sunning themselves in some Tuscan town. One also finds that when Russian history paintings begin to be produced, they follow precisely kind of norms and standards which are being used for depictions of classical, let's say, Roman and Greek historical paintings. And this changes tremendously in the 1860s, 1870s. Just as like in the Russian novel and in Russian literature, Russian painting begins to take a much more greater interest in social realism. And we find this with the famous school of Russian artists and their successors, the so-called itinerants. The itinerants wandered around Russia, were famous basically for sending around, traveling art exhibitions to the provinces. And this is why they were called, so this is why they were called the itinerants. They would send art exhibitions across Russia, and therefore for the first time engaged provincial Russian society in a really serious, really institutionalized way into the growing Russian art public. And they were the first group of artists who were truly able to live on the sales of their paintings, rather than money and salaries painted by a beneficial aristocratic patron. Now often, not entirely correctly, but often, these individuals have been associated with political radicalism, and certainly a few of their number were involved in painting politically radical paintings. Indeed, by choosing a socially realistic approach, they could hardly avoid this charge of radicalism, because it was largely held up by depicting Russian society in all of its with all of its poverty, with its crime, all of its destitution, all of its inequalities. By simply depicting this, it was argued that this was a counterpoint to Russian imperial ideology. Now, one of the most famous, most allegedly radical paintings of the itinerants was that by Ilya Repin, where it depicts the murder, Ivan the Terrible murdering his son and heir. And this was largely interpreted by Russian society as an allegorical image where Ivan the Terrible stands for the Tsar aristocracy, murdering the best and brightest of its society, the young intellectual radicals and intelligentsia. The painting caused an absolute outroar when it was displayed, and in fact it was banned by the imperial authorities very shortly after. Given all this, given that there are radical tendencies in politics and in social questions, it should not come as a tremendous shock that the itinerants did not portray the church in a very good light, or indeed religious subjects in a very good light. Generally speaking, the tropes of anti-clericalism, drunkenness, gluttony, hypocrisy, sexual immorality, etc., are very prominently in display in the itinerants' depictions of religious life. As we're going to see, Vasilii Perov, in particular, ran an almost cottage industry of producing paintings depicting Russian Orthodoxy in a negative light. The few that did try and tackle religious themes in a more positive way often denuded it of any kind of sacred connection with the sacred, or indeed any connection to Russian Orthodoxy as confession. Probably the most famous example of this is Ivan Kramskoy's Christ in the Wilderness, which depicts not Christ as a religious figure, but rather Christ as a normal individual going through tremendous physical and psychological suffering. It's a psychological portrait, in other words, not a religious one. This is very much Christ as a man, not as a divine entity. Now, I'm just going to leave this slide up for you for a couple of seconds for those of you watching. I would recommend that as I talk about the paintings in the next few slides, you can pause and have a look at this. I will probably say at most of the points on here, but you can always return to this. Okay? So just to quickly move on. So this is the famous controversial painting of Ilya Repin, the murder, Ivan the Terrible's murder of his son and heir, also named Ivan. Precisely controversial because it was held Ivan symbolized the Russian autocracy, murdering, repressing, destroying the best of the Russian youth. And here we have Ivan Kramskoy's Christ in the Wilderness. As I mentioned, an intensely psychological portrait of a savior, not a religious one. Christ here is a man, not a god. Now we move on to some of the more paintings based around entirely the Russian Orthodox Church itself. So here we have, again, really where the Orthodox Church and its rituals are being satirized, I think, and it's mocked to a certain extent. So here you have, for instance, the deacon singing Long Life at a Merchant's Birthday. And you can see the deacon taking the center of the portrait, the center of the painting, is almost inherently ridiculous in the way he's painted. And that ridiculousness is only accentuated by the reaction of the people around him. On the one hand, you have boredom or mere curiosity. I think you see this among the women on the one side. And then you have the frivolity, the joviality, the drinking of the male party makers on the other side. So in other words, this religious ceremony and the figure of the deacon himself are being satirized, being made out to be inherently ridiculous. Now here we have a famous painting of Perov's. Sorry, just one second. Yes. Of Perov's the monastery dinner at the monastery canteen. And here we see something a much more socially critical vision of Russian Orthodox churchmen and the institutions of Russian Orthodoxy. So here you see, for instance, a dinner in a monastery. It's supposed to be a humble place, but yet there are very rich dishes being served. A very rich fish dish. A great luxury is being served. Wine in copious amounts is being poured. You can see, on the one hand, a monk is begging a noblewoman and her husband to take a seat at a table. Meanwhile, just below them are beggars and poor people who are being excluded from the dinner. And on the other side, you can see a servant being berated by the monk because he's failing to open a wine glass quickly enough. So in other words, we see here the idea of orthodox monasticism as hypocritical. While it preaches asceticism, giving up the pleasures of the world, in fact it's doing anything but. It's indulging in fish, in wine. And rather than giving things to the poor and helping the poor, it's shown as pushing them away and instead inviting the people who are already rich to the table. A similar social message comes from Perov's picture of the Easter procession. Here we see a clearly and visibly drunk priest. Some of his parishioners are also clearly drunk. A beggar is sleeping underneath the porch. In the background, dimly in the shadows, you can see two figures who seem to be conducting a business deal. Perhaps here Perov is aiming to sort of recall Christ's rejection of the moneylenders from the temple. And the entire scene, the entire atmosphere of this scene is gloomy. It's covered in shadow, it's grey, it's muddy, it's brown. Really, there's no joy here. This is a boring, earthly, hypocritical orthodoxy run by drunken priests for the benefit of drunken parishioners. Again, by Perov again, another social image, another social satire. So here we have a priest giving the service. And there's a distinction between the two halves of the audience. On the one side, we see the Russian people, two men and their children, looking up at the priest attentively, listening to his words, obviously displaying very pious religious behavior. But then we see on the other side the attitude of the aristocracy, the nobility. The fat landowner is drunk. The two people behind him are arguing while the priest is speaking. And you can see that the young aristocratic lady is being I would imagine, very seductively talked to by the young man behind her. So in other words, there is a connotation of adultery. So here we have the Orthodox Church is almost supporting a division between the two stratum of Russian society, of creating and supporting this division, and of even sponsoring and ignoring noble hypocrisy. It seems to me in any case that the priest is almost focusing more on his peasant parishioners who are attentively listening than on the sinful aristocracy. And here, very famously, this is Ilya Repin's The Cross Procession. If you ever go to St. Petersburg, please go to the Russian Museum where it's kept. It's an absolutely huge canvas. It's worth seeing. But anyway, here again we have the idea of an Orthodox ritual, an Orthodox ceremony being used to uphold the social order of the church. In the front of the procession, the social order of the Russian Empire. So in the front of the procession, we see the peasantry. Directly behind them, we see the middle classes, the merchants, the Intelligentsia maybe, sort of well-to-do middle class. Then behind him, we see the priests, the clergy, and behind the clergy, we see very well-dressed aristocrats. So in this church ritual is the framing for Russia's extremely unequal, extremely differentiated society. And this impression is further given by the fact that all this order is kept together by two lines of police horsemen. The police and the church ritual, in other words, providing the framing for this extremely unequal, extremely differentiated, hierarchical order. And we also see that this is a site for domestic and indeed wider societal violent abuse. We see at the very front of the pane a father hitting his child, a child who moreover seems to be walking on a stick. And you can see, I hope, the figure of the white officer just behind the peasants, striking down with his whip at the procession. So in other words, Repin is depicting this very typical Orthodox ceremony, normally traditionally a site for communal togetherness, as a site of communal division and a site of violence in support of maintaining this division. Now, I think really we're running out of time, so I'm going to bring this very quickly to its conclusion by just having a quick look at some more positive depictions of Russian Orthodox subjects that emerge from the Silver Age of the end of the 19th century. So firstly, we have Mikhail Nestorov, who, as in literature, moved away from the ultra-realism sponsored by people like Repin and Perov in the early decades to something more symbolic. As a highly religious man, he often spent a great deal of time developing emotional, symbolic depictions of various Orthodox saints' tales, scenes from the Bible, and indeed creating some images in order to depict Orthodoxy as a unifying force in Russian society. So I've just given you a few examples here. We'll just have to go for them very quickly. If you want to know which ones precisely they are, you can see the last point in the slide here. So this is Holy Rus, a procession of nuns. This was a painting in a convent established, the Martha Mary convent, established at the beginning of the 20th century in Moscow by one of the Romanov princesses. This is quite a good one, depicting sort of the collective of Holy Rus. This is the idea again of Orthodoxy combining together the Russian people. And in fact, you can see this was painted during the First World War. And indeed, the figure in the foreground, beside the boy, if you look at these sort of along the row, the two biggest figures are a blind soldier, obviously wounded in the war, being guided along by a monastic nurse. You see various figures from Russian history and Russian society all united together, not separated in a hierarchy like in Repin's picture, but here unified as one mass, following this particular boy who is meant to be a prophet. And finally, for a really radical departure from, in some ways, the style, no, I beg your pardon, a really radical use of the style and content of iconography is discovered in the modernist movements of the early 20th century. So here we have the futurist painter Natalia Goncharova, who combined particularly Italian primitivism, and its focus on primary colours, and some aspects of futurism with imagery from traditional Russian Orthodox iconography. So I've given you, and indeed, although there's little to say that her work was a direct attack on the church, it largely wasn't. Still, the use of these iconographic styles in such a radical way meant that her work, The Evangelists, was banned for blasphemy in 1911. So I've given you three works here. The first one, Archangel Michael, 1910, The Evangelists, in 1911, and then St. George in 1914. And the last one was actually a piece used in sort of wartime propaganda pictures. So here we have the first, Archangel Michael, then the picture that was banned for blasphemy, the Evangelists, and secondly, and finally, this piece of St. George, which was used in the sort of as a patriotic rallying cry, as the image of St. George often has been in previous periods of the Russian past. The idea of an Orthodox military saint riding out to destroy the dragon of evil. So okay then, that marks the end of my very brief, very selective guide to how Orthodoxy, its rituals and traditions, shaped modern Russian culture, and indeed how these new forms of modern Russian culture related to the Russian Orthodox Church and to its traditions. I do hope you'll forgive me. I think I've been a bit of a rush in this lecture to try and get it finished in a relatively shorter time than previous lectures, so I've been fumbling over myself. But anyway, in any case, thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time.